All right. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Warner Wilson. We have a great one for you today. It's been a while, but we got another debate about to go down, man. Is human reasoning autonomous? Oh boy, it's about to get hot in this one. Got some good guys in with to jump in this ring. Got Mr. Seth Bloomsburg and David Pallmann. These guys are no stranger to the Gospel Truth Octagon, man. They're no stranger to this Octagon, man. I'm glad you guys have decided to jump back in on this one. But before we bring them guys in, I always want to encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Please do that. Make sure you hit that like. Make sure you hit that subscribe. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with what The Gospel Truth has going on. And as always, this Gospel Truth content is not only on Facebook and YouTube, but also on Instagram and Twitter. So make sure you flow over there and be with the ministry in that capacity as well. Also, all this content is on podcast. So there's another avenue for you to be connected. Go to the podcast, subscribe, and follow there. And after you're there, please leave a good rating so you can stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth has going on. And I do have some shows coming up here in the future that I would like to make known to you. All right, I have hold on, let me restart that. Start with the earliest one, not the late date, the early date. All right, coming up May 10th, I have Oneness or Trinity, Biblical View of God. I have Stacy Turberville versus Anthony Rogers. That's coming up here Monday, May 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that is Universalism True. I have A.K. Richardson, West Fallen Camp, I believe I pronounced that right, coming up Friday, May 14th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. After that was Mary Sinless, a good buddy of mine, Jeremiah Nortier. Go jump in with Matthew Broderick. Both of these guys have been on before. So that's going down May 17th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then lastly is the Calvinistic view of election biblical. Stephen Young versus Isaac Hensley. That's coming up May 22nd at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So once again, that is just the next 4 shows coming up here on The Gospel Truth. So make sure you stay in the loop. Make sure you do your thing. Please do it, because it is imperative that you stay in the loop with The Gospel Truth, man. We have a whole bunch of stuff coming up, and I don't want you to miss it. All right. That said, I have, once again, these two guys are great guys, 2 buddies of mine, man. I love these guys, man. They're great at what they do. They argue all the time. Every time you jump on Facebook, you guarantee to find Seth or David getting into it with somebody on these threads, man. I go there, I go to some of these Facebook groups and I just want some encouragement. I just want some encouragement. Then I jump in these groups and I see Seth and David arguing. I'm like, well, there goes that encouragement. I'm out of here. I'm gone, Nah, these guys are great, though. Let me bring these guys in so they can say hi to y'all, man. What's going on, fellas? How y'all doing, man?
Hello. Good to be on, Marlon.
Good. Glad y'all back, man. Glad y'all back to another installment of The Gospel Truth, man. This is going to be a hot topic, man. You guys have been debating this subject matter for quite some time, man, and you guys finally jumped in. Usually it's a Calvinist debate. David is known for his animosity, if you will, and not no hot animosity, but a level of animosity towards Calvinism, and he's usually debating that subject matter, man. So I'm glad he jumped on here. And Seth, you're doing your thing, man, and I'm glad both of y'all on here, man. But before we jump into this debate, I'm going to give you guys a chance to introduce yourself to the audience. People probably know you already, but you never know. Somebody don't know you. So, Seth, if you don't mind, man, give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Yeah, most people probably do know me at this point. I did my undergraduate degree at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho. My thesis topic was on apologetics, and basically I took Richard Carrier's book, Why I Don't Believe in God, or Why I'm Not a Christian, and wrote a paper basically critiquing it. And I've just studied apologetics ever since then. I do it because I think it's important. I think all Christians should study it at some level. And that's partly why I'm here.
All right, cool. Seth, thank you once again for coming on. All right, David, give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Yeah, David Pallmann. If you might know me through my YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason. I do apologetics and theology over there. I also co-host, well, at least for now, the podcast Proselytize or Apostatize with my co-host David Russell. I'm a member of the Society of Evangelical Arminians, and I periodically write articles for Free Thinking Ministries.
All right, guys. Cool. Thank you guys for that. All right, so we're going to jump into this debate, man. We ain't going to waste no more time. All right, once again, the topic of this debate is human reasoning autonomous? All right, so we're going to start off with 15-minute opening statements. That's going to be followed by 5-minute rebuttals. And we're going to 40-minute cross-examination. The first 20 minutes will be 10 minutes each to ask questions. And then the final 20 minutes will be more of an open discussion where you guys be able to hash out some lingering questions. After that, we have 5-minute closings and then some Q&A from the audience. Good with that?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right, Seth, you want to go first, even though you're not arguing the affirmative. You do want to go first. That's cool, man. It's all good. So let me know when you're ready, Seth, and we'll set your time, and you will be able to give it a go.
Okay, I'm ready now.
All right, buddy, you got it, man. 15 minutes.
All right. The question before us is this: is human reasoning autonomous? Given the definitions we will be using, my answer for the purposes of the debate will be no, but this will require some unpacking. The first distinction I want to make is regenerate reasoning versus unregenerate reasoning. The Bible makes clear that sin has gravely affected every aspect of man's being, a concept called total depravity. In the Bible, we are told that in Christ is deposited all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, thus implying you cannot have the treasures of wisdom and knowledge unless you are redeemed by Christ. Romans 1 clearly says that men who do not worship God become vain in their reasonings. In Isaiah, we are commanded by God to come and reason together. So interpreting Scripture with Scripture, this means that we are told simultaneously to give up on reasoning that does not base its validity on belief in God, because such reasoning ends up in vanity anyway. And yet Scripture also makes clear that unbelievers do know God as they seek to intentionally ignore this truth. Greg Bonson once used the analogy of someone sitting on a volleyball in a pool. He can sit there struggling to stay on and claim out loud he has no idea that there is a volleyball underneath him the whole time, but he is not only in contact with the volleyball the entire time, he has to actively suppress the truth of the volleyball while he is in contact with it. This is called self-deception, and it is what's called a second-order belief. All men know God. In other words, all men have a true, justified belief in God. But they also have a second-order belief about that knowledge. They deceive themselves into believing that they don't believe in God. Thus, when we talk of unbelievers, we are really talking about people who know God, but do not confess that truth openly. They suppress that truth. An unbeliever is someone who claims he doesn't know God, yet he does, deep down. The second distinction I want to make is the difference between a proximate source of knowledge and an ultimate source of knowledge. Imagine yourself on a diving board. In one sense, you are on the diving board, and it is holding you up. In a more ultimate sense, the concrete that holds up the diving board is what's really holding you up. This is similar to the relationship of your knowledge and reason to the Bible. You can use your knowledge and sense perception and reason to look at and understand the Bible better and better, but this does not make your proximate knowledge the foundation of your reasoning. Scripture is. In the same way, you can examine the concrete holding up a diving board while you are on the diving board, but this does not mean the diving board is holding the concrete up. This now brings us to the question of what we mean by autonomous. Autonomous reasoning is simply this: reasoning that is not based on the worldview of Scripture, but instead based on some other worldview or set of presuppositions. And I need to define those terms. A worldview is a network of presuppositions which are not verified by the procedures of natural science, regarding reality, knowing, and conduct, in terms of which every element of human experience is related and interpreted. A presupposition is an elementary assumption in one's reasoning, or in the process by which opinions are formed. It is not just any assumption in an argument, but a personal commitment that is held at the most basic level of one's network of beliefs. Presupposition's starting point, in terms of which everything else is interpreted and evaluated. As such, presuppositions have the greatest authority in one's thinking, being treated as one's least negotiable beliefs and being granted the highest immunity to revision. Now, everyone has a worldview, such as Hinduism, atheism, Buddhism, Islam, or materialism, Stoicism, or something else, and everyone uses their reason and sense perception to interpret the facts around them. But their worldview is the concrete. Their reason is the diving board. So after all this analysis, this brings us back to the original question of the debate. Is human reasoning autonomous? The answer is this. Yes, all men reason autonomously until they are converted, and their reason is regenerated. But no, they ought not reason autonomously. My answer to the question of whether man's reasoning is autonomous is no, because man's reasoning ought not be autonomous. Now, I have to make a comment about classical apologetics. It's now necessary to go into more detail about what I don't mean by autonomous, given how it's frequently understood by classical apologists. In the book Classical Apologetics, Sproul et al. Have this to say. We consider it self-evident that it, reasoning, must start with a person who is making the intellectual journey. One simply cannot start outside of himself. This is very true, and presuppositionalists agree with this. We all agree that man must stand on the diving board. He must use his own reason to work through arguments and evidences of his beliefs. Everyone starts with their approximate source of knowledge, even if they have not given thought or are unaware of what their ultimate source of knowledge is. Someone may be standing on the diving board without knowing the nature of the concrete beneath. Sproul goes further on page 231. We must begin with ourselves, that is, autonomously. Sproul is very clearly defining autonomy differently than presuppositionalists do. As I stated before, everyone, classical and presuppositional, agree we begin with ourselves in the sense of approximate source of knowledge. We cannot start outside of ourselves. We must begin proximately with our reason and knowledge. But, as presuppositionalists have labored to point out, that is not what we mean by autonomy. When we say autonomy, we are specifically referring to having a different ultimate reference point than the biblical worldview. We are not referring to one's proximate source of knowledge when we refer to autonomy. At this point, someone may object, but what if someone is unaware of what the scriptural worldview is? Well, then they must be taught it. And it ought to be demonstrated to them that unless they accept the scriptural worldview as one's ultimate source of knowledge, knowledge claims from the proximate source of knowledge have no justification. Many people who do not have much awareness of what their ultimate source of knowledge Many people do not have much awareness of what their ultimate source of knowledge is. Many people have not formally studied any philosophy, but if they don't want their knowledge to be vain in its reasonings, they need to explore this. A quote from Brant Bosserman is helpful here. When discussing the doctrine of the Trinity and how we know it to be true, Brant Bosserman quotes Van Til when he says in a footnote on page 155 of his book that we learn the Trinitarian view as described from the Scripture and accept it on the authority of Christ. But this being the case, we at the same time realize that it is this biblical position alone that offers an intelligent foundation for the existence of all of man's functions. He says this in the book, The Trinity and the Vindication of Christian Paradox. This is a clear example of proximate versus ultimate sources of knowledge. It is a fact that without belief in the Trinity and the scriptural worldview, ultimate source of knowledge, engaging in hermeneutical endeavors in Scripture or in any other field of inquiry whatsoever has no ultimate foundation or justification whatsoever. When we stand on the diving board of our proximate source of knowledge, our reason and sense perception, etc., and look at and examine the concrete of the scriptural worldview, and realize that only the Christian concrete will hold us up, we understand that all other houses are sinking sand. Atheism is sand that can't hold up a diving board. So is materialism, and Stoicism, and Islam, etc. When we realize and accept God as our creator and ourselves as the creatures, our reasoning itself is regenerated, along with the rest of our being, and we no longer deceive ourselves into believing that God doesn't exist.
All right. That's good. You good to go, Seth?
Yep.
All right, cool. All right, David, you're up for your 15-minute opening statement. Let me restart your time. And
back here, I want to screen share.
All right. Yeah, you can go ahead and screen share now.
Coming through good?
Yes, sir. Coming through excellent. Let me know you're ready and I'll start your time.
Awesome. All right, yeah, I'll start now.
All right, you got it. 15 minutes.
All right, so there is a debate among Christian apologists regarding the proper way in which they ought to best defend their faith. Among the competing options, the presuppositional method has proven to be the most controversial. Roughly, this method of apologetics seeks to argue that the very principles of rationality upon which all argumentation depends cannot themselves be explained or justified apart from the Christian worldview. There are many points of contention between presuppositionalists and evidentialists, But in this debate, we will zero in on what I see as our foundational difference, the autonomy of reason. I intend to defend the thesis that human reasoning is autonomous. It seems to me that denial of man's ability to reason autonomously is the key distinctive claim of presuppositionalism. If this idea is false, then the entire edifice of presuppositionalism collapses. Let me begin defining what I mean by autonomy. There are some very obvious senses in which human reasoning is not autonomous, so I must emphasize from the start that I am using the definition that presuppositionalists themselves use. For example, Greg Bahnsen defines it this way. By epistemological autonomy is meant the ability to attain to knowledge independent of God's revelation and existence. The person who rejects the Word of God feels that he can find truth in his own powers of exploration, examination, and explanation. To reject revelational epistemology, then, is to commit yourself to the truth of autonomous epistemology. In short, then, I'm defending the proposition that human beings can attain knowledge without in any way depending upon special revelation from God. Now, this is not to say that we can gain all knowledge independently of God, because certainly there are some truths that God reveals to us which we could not discover on our own. I only intend to defend an epistemological model which is consistent with the proposition that all knowledge does not depend upon divine revelation or theistic presuppositions. In order to gain a clear understanding of what exactly a defense of autonomous human reasoning should look like, it will be beneficial to examine why exactly Bahnsen claims one must presuppose Christian theism. The crux of his argument is that without presupposing the truth of the truth of God's revelation, one cannot justify their belief in the so-called preconditions of intelligibility. Now, these are taken to be things that are necessary for one to have knowledge at all. And Bahnsen's favorite examples are the laws of logic and belief in the regularity of nature. Now, Bahnsen's argument here presents a serious challenge for my position, because after all, other than abduction, we have only two forms of reasoning, deduction and induction. If our belief in deduction and induction is unjustified, then Bahnsen is quite correct when he says that autonomous human reasoning is impossible. One could, of course, point out that Bahnsen is in the same boat. He must arbitrarily suppose that the revelation contained in Scripture is true without independent justification. But this observation does nothing to salvage autonomous human reasoning. Thus, I see no way forward other than to argue that belief in deduction and induction are indeed justifiable. And if this can be done successfully, then autonomy will be vindicated and the presuppositionalist argument will be defeated. However, before turning to the question of how we can justify these methods of reasoning, I'll need to lay down a stipulation and offer an account of non-inferential justification. The stipulation is that circular reasoning in any form is principally incapable of justification. Now, Seth is going to want to argue that all reasoning is circular. I hope to show you that this is false, but even if it were true, let it be noted that even if circular reasoning is unavoidable, this does nothing to indicate that it can be justificatory. Like, there's an implicit is-ought fallacy here when presuppositionalists try to argue that circular reasoning is okay just because everyone does it. It simply doesn't follow from the fact that because all reasoning is circular, that it therefore ought to be. The motivation for those who defend circular reasoning seems to spring from an assumption that the only way a belief can be justified is by means of an argument. However, this assumption is simply wrong. If beliefs could only be justified through arguments, then this would lead to an infinite regress. Every premise of every argument would need an argument in support of it. And each premise of these supporting arguments would likewise need supporting arguments, and so on infinitely. Consequently, we need a working theory of premise acceptability. We need premises that have unmediated justification. Here we face the regress problem. Most of our beliefs are justified on the basis of other beliefs, and these beliefs on the basis of still others. But where does it end? I propose that classical foundationalism provides the best solution to this problem. According to foundationalism, all beliefs come in one of two types, inferential and non-inferential. Every justified inferential belief ultimately owes its justification to a justified non-inferential belief. These justified non-inferential beliefs are thought to be foundational because all other knowledge is built upon them. Clearly, if such beliefs exist and are justified, then they serve to terminate the regress. But how are these beliefs justified if not by other beliefs? I think the most promising account of non-inferential justification is the theory of direct acquaintance. Now, according to this theory, non-inferential justification consists of three distinct acquaintances. First, direct acquaintance with a thought, that would be a truth bearer. Second, direct acquaintance with a fact, that would be a truth maker. And third, direct acquaintance with the correspondence that obtains between the thought and the fact. The direct acquaintance with correspondence between truth bearer and truth maker ensures that the belief is justified and infallibly so. Thus, these three acquaintances, taken in conjunction, constitute a sufficient account of non-inferential justification. When everything that is constitutive of a thought's being true is immediately before consciousness, there is nothing more one could want or need to justify a belief. Direct acquaintance is not itself a belief, but it relates the subject to a fact in such a way that the subject is aware of the correspondence between his thought and the fact that makes it true. This is how beliefs can be justified immediately without appealing to further beliefs. All of that may seem a little complicated, but the basic idea is rather simple. Think of the belief that you have a headache. You do not infer this belief from some other belief. You're simply directly acquainted with the fact of it. The same point extends to any experience. What you see, hear, feel, smell, or taste is all justified through your direct acquaintance with the relevant facts. So having set forth a working theory of non-inferential justification, let's turn to defend methods of inference. Let's begin with the laws of logic. Greg Bonson asks, what justification has the autonomous man for assuming the law of non-contradiction? For the autonomous man to appeal to the law of non-contradiction in order to support his use of the law is to reason in a vicious circle. Now, how could any argument for the truth of logical laws not fall prey to vicious circularity, since all arguments inevitably depend on the validity of logical laws? And this is what's known in philosophy as the logocentric predicament. And it would be an understatement to say that the general attitude towards the logocentric predicament in contemporary philosophy is that there is no non-circular solution to this problem. For example, Michael Dummett says, it is of little use to argue for the possibility of justifying logical laws without circularity. And then Robert Hanna goes even further, saying, the epistemic circularity of logic entails both that logic is inexplicable and unjustified. The circularity of logic is a vicious circularity, or more starkly put, logic is groundless. However, I'm convinced that this is just not so. In the previous section, I introduced the idea that some beliefs are justified without mediation, but are known through direct acquaintance. It seems to me that this is also the solution to the logocentric predicament. My strategy here is known as metafoundationalism, and it depends on the related ideas of a priori knowledge and analyticity. A priori knowledge is knowledge gained apart from experience. Analytic a priori knowledge is understood to be a priori propositions that are true solely in virtue of the meanings of the terms involved. Now, a common example of an analytic proposition is the sentence, all bachelors are unmarried men. The sentence is true based on the meaning of the word bachelor. Now, this explains how an analytic sentence is true easily enough, but the key difficulty facing any theory of analyticity is not so much to explain how analytic propositions can be true, but rather to explain how exactly it is that an analytic proposition is justified. Now, my proposal is that the justification lies in one's direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts. Analytic propositions are true in virtue of what they mean and justified by one's direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts. I propose that laws of logic are themselves analytic propositions and therefore justified, immediately for anyone who is directly acquainted with them. So to summarize, belief in the laws of logic can be justified a priori via analyticity because the justification is not mediated through arguments. The justification does not depend on an argument, and as such, the justification does not assume the laws of logic. Therefore, laws of logic can be justified in a non-circular way. Now, that is one way to justify belief in logical laws. Another method is abductively. Earlier, I argued that for the thesis that perceptions are immediately justified by virtue of one's direct acquaintance with that which one perceives. And it's possible, I think, to utilize these perceptions in support of the truth of logical laws. Consider that any perception that is given to me has certain properties, and among these are logical properties. Now, if I acquire a very large number of non-contradictory perceptions and acquire no perceptions that are exceptions, then I may justifiably infer that the best explanation for my uniform experience of non-contradictory facts is that there is a law of non-contradiction. Note also that this method allows that genuine contradictions may exist and could be discovered in the future. So it is falsifiable and therefore not circular. However, until this is done, the argument gives abductive justification for believing in laws of logic. Finally, let us turn to induction. David Hume famously argued that there is no justification for believing that the future will be like the past. To argue that the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every other day assumes that there is regularity in nature. But why should this be assumed? One cannot justify this belief by appealing to the past on pain of circularity, for this assumes the very thing one is attempting to prove. So Bahnsen, what right have we to read the future into the past? The universal uniformity of nature cannot be verified from the experience of the independent thinker in any final sense, since that principle exceeds the bounds of his experience. So the most fundamental premise of all autonomous science, the uniformity of nature, is neither empirically nor rationally justifiable. The solution to the problem of induction is found in the direct inference or the proportional syllogism, a non-deductive inference form. Direct inferences follow the same structure as traditional deductive syllogisms, however they differ in that the crucial premise is proportionate to the given frequency of some property within a reasonably large sample of the population. Now, although the conclusion of a direct inference follows with assurance, because the syllogism is inherently statistical, the conclusion is only probabilistic. But how are we to justify our belief in the crucial premise of a direct inference? This can be done through a combination of Bernoulli's theorem and a second direct inference. Now, according to Bernoulli's theorem, most large samples differ only a little from the populations from which they are drawn. And with this theorem and a second direct inference, we can construct an argument which will rationally extend our knowledge to the unsampled members of a population. Once again, such an inference is only probabilistic. However, since this method does not assume that the unsampled members of a population will be like the sampled members, it avoids circularity while giving us rational justification for extending our knowledge beyond our own experience. Hence, we have a cogent response to Hume's problem of induction. We do not have to presuppose the uniformity of nature. Before closing, remiss if I did not briefly explain how God's revelation does fit into an evidentialist epistemology. Contrary to many popular characterizations of evidentialism, evidentialists do not hold that knowledge cannot be gained through revelation. We simply acknowledge that one's belief in revelation as a source of knowledge must be justified by means of evidence, as John DePoe says. Authorities play a valuable epistemic role because they are avenues for justified beliefs and knowledge that are inaccessible to us without them, or they make the procurement of such epistemic goods more convenient. Importantly, however, for me to embrace an authority justifiably, I must have good reasons to trust the source as an authority in the domains where I regard it as an authority. So in conclusion, I strongly urge Christians to move away from the presuppositionalist method of argumentation. It may sound sophisticated. It may even seem irrefutable due to the fact that most atheists lack the philosophical training necessary to identify the flaws in it. And I think the paradigm case of that would be Greg Bahnsen's debate with Stein, because Stein was obviously not prepared for anything that Bahnsen was bringing up. And so that gives a false sense of confidence to many presuppositionalists because they think, oh, well, I argue like this, I can stump any atheist. Well, no, it's just that Stein didn't know the answers to the questions that Bahnsen was raising. That doesn't mean answers don't exist. So I believe that presuppositionalism thrives for the most part due to philosophical ignorance. I get that there are exceptions. There are crazy smart guys like Chris Bohl and James Anderson and Greg Welty who hold, to a form of presuppositionalism. But most people out there who are just holding to it, they don't know the philosophy. They're not familiar with these kinds of responses. And so I think that, that's the main reason why it gets popular. But it's just simply not true that only by presupposing Christianity can one justify their belief in the so-called preconditions of intelligibility. This can and should be done autonomously.
All right. Thank you guys so much for that. Thank you for that. All right, Seth, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. David's opening statement. So let me reset this timer and then I will let you know when to go. All right, let me know you're ready and I'll stop the time.
All right, well, I would just respond to a couple of points. First of all, he talked about the various forms of reasoning, abduction, deduction, and induction. I think that he missed transcendental reasoning because that's the whole point. That's the whole project behind presuppositional apologetics, is that it is a distinct kind of argumentation from abduction, deduction, or induction. It's a transcendental argumentation. It's arguing about what the preconditions of intelligibility must be for any given particular fact. Second of all, just for the audience's sake, I would point out he is defining autonomy differently than I did. At least from what I can tell, he defined autonomy as believing that human beings can attain knowledge without special revelation. Well, I would simply say that's like saying I can stand on a diving board without concrete. Somebody might not have the theological or philosophical sophistication to understand worldview terminology or philosophy or understand Hume's problem of induction or whatever. In the same way that somebody can stand on a diving board, somebody can physically stand on a diving board without knowing what concrete is. But that doesn't mean that concrete isn't there. That doesn't mean that concrete doesn't exist. And that doesn't mean that it makes any sense for them to claim that, they can't really be skeptical about the existence of concrete, because the concrete is what allows them to stay up and say anything. Second of all, when it comes to circular reasoning, he's maintaining that circular reasoning is always fallacious. And I would simply I would challenge him, okay, well, go ahead and prove that. And now make sure you prove that without using the laws of logic, because if you do, you're engaging in circular reasoning. You're defining what is logical and what isn't, but you're smuggling in the answer to the question beforehand. It's not an is-ought fallacy. We're not claiming that, well, everybody has to, therefore we ought to. No, it's more like arguing about the existence of air. Two people can argue about the existence of air, but I would point out that the entire time they are both breathing. They both have to presuppose the existence of air in order to argue for the existence of air or to argue against the existence of air. That's essentially what the atheist is, or any non-Christian is basically doing when it comes to the existence of the God of Scripture. They have to presuppose, in order to make their argument for or against God's existence even cogent, they have to presuppose that he exists. C.S. Lewis used I love using his example of cutting off a tree branch that you're sitting on. That's what it's like to argue against God. In the process of arguing against him, you're arguing against the being that gave you the ability to reason. Second of all, I would question exactly what he talked about, an immediately justified belief. He talked about having direct acquaintance with the fact. I think he said direct acquaintance with the concepts. Well, I would simply ask, how can somebody have direct acquaintance with all instances of the laws of logic? You can't justify a universal transcendental claim by simply appealing to your own experience, the raw facts of your experience. I mean, just because, as Hume pointed out when he was critiquing things like the teleological argument, just because nature is uniform here doesn't mean it will be in the future. It doesn't mean it is on the other side of the universe. It doesn't mean it's uniform outside of any part of your own experience. The same is true of the laws of logic. I mean, unless David wants to assert that he's omniscient, he can't have acquaintance with every single instance of the laws of logic, and therefore, by his own standard, he can't justify them. Let's see, what else was there? I think I'll have to keep the rest of that for cross-examination.
All right, cool. Thank you, Seth, for that. All right, cool. Thank you, Seth, for that rebuttal. All right, David, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me restart your time, and let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, you got it.
All right, so on this issue of total depravity that Seth brought up, I actually want to agree with him on that. I do agree with the doctrine of total depravity. I don't think that entails that a person can have no knowledge apart from divine revelation. That's just not a part of what the doctrine means. That's not even what Calvinists have traditionally understood it to mean. So I think that's a bit of a non sequitur here. He also brought up some exegetical texts. I don't really care to dive into the exegesis of it. It's not that doesn't matter. That's just kind of not where I wanted to place the emphasis in this debate. So I will actually forego exegetical discussions on the biblical texts. A lot of Seth's opening there depended on this distinction that he makes a lot between the proximate and the ultimate. And he gives this diving board analogy that he gets from Van Til, and he gives it a lot, but we don't really get an explanation of what is the relevant difference here between these two sorts of knowledge that we're supposed to be getting from these two. Now, he endorsed a justified true belief definition of knowledge in his opening statement, and I agree with him. I think that knowledge is justified true belief. But he seemed to flatly contradict that when he described the proximate source of knowledge, right? When he described knowledge from the diving board, he said that, oh, you don't get justification from that source. Well, hang on. If your definition of knowledge is justified true belief, this isn't a source of knowledge then. If you're not getting justification from your proximate source of knowledge, it's not a source of knowledge. Just, I don't know. So that just seems like a flat contradiction in his whole epistemology there. What is this knowledge that we're getting from the proximate source? It's unjustified knowledge when knowledge has to be justified, like by the definition of the word. Now he also brought up this issue of circular reasoning. And it's interesting because he gave this same objection, I believe, to Jacob Brunton in his debate with him. He asked him if he could give him an argument against all types of circular reasoning, but that he couldn't give him a reason because somehow that would be engaging in circular reasoning. Now, I'm not sure what he's going to have to explain that last part to me about why it would be circular to give an argument against circular reasoning, right? He said, because it'll depend on the laws of logic. Well, so what? I gave two non-circular arguments for the laws of logic in my opening statement. So if those arguments hold, then it's not going to be in any way circular to give a logical argument for a problem with circular reasoning. I'm trying to pull up my argument against circular reasoning here. I think I got 2 minutes to give this. So let me give my argument against epistemic circularity here. Sorry, it's way down in here. All right. So here's my argument. Circular reasoning is incapable of conferring justification in principle because it necessarily depends upon the truth of what it is purported to justify. By definition, circular reasoning entails that a premise within an argument is equivalent to or depends upon the truth of the conclusion of the same argument. The circular argument to be fallacious because they constitute no positive gain in knowledge. Doesn't matter how big one makes the circle by including additional irrelevant premises. John Frame seems to kind of suggest that when he's like, oh, well, we got broad circularity. Well, I mean, what's that? Adding more additional premises to an already circular argument? I mean, that doesn't help you. So as long as the conclusion is identical to one of the premises, the argument will be incapable of giving us justification because the corresponding premise will itself need to be justified before the circular argument can justify anything. But if the corresponding premise can't be justified, then the circular argument becomes if the corresponding premise can be justified, the circular argument becomes unnecessary since the conclusion is already justified. So then the dilemma for the proponent of circular reasoning is this. If the corresponding premise of a circular argument is justified, the circular argument becomes unnecessary. If it is not justified, then the circular argument cannot confer justification. Either horn of that dilemma is going to prove fatal, so circularity must be rejected. And I don't know if I have time to get into important distinctions between usage, but suffice to say that Seth is very unclear when he talks about using something, right? There are functional and justificatory ways of using things, and it's not circular to use something in a functional sense. It's only circular if you're using something in the defense of itself in a justificatory sense. And so I think he tends to conflate those two with each other because if I'm going to use reason to give an argument for why it is that reason can lead us to true conclusions, he's going to want to say that's circular. But that's using it in a functional sense, not a justificatory sense.
All right. Good stuff, guys. So now we're about to jump into the fire round, guys. Fire round. We're about to get this going, man. We're about to jump to this cross-examination. This cross-examination will be 40 minutes total. The first 20 minutes will be 10 minutes each to ask questions. And then that'll be followed up with 20-minute open discussion where we can tackle those lingering questions. All right, guys. So, Seth, you're up for your cross-examination of David Pallmann. Let me know you're ready, and I'll start your time.
Okay. You said, David, you said that you could found it. You talked about classical foundational and foundational beliefs, and foundational beliefs can be immediately justified beliefs. Am I construing you correctly?
That is correct.
Okay. Um, how can you have an immediately justified belief in the laws of logic if, in order to it to be an immediately justified belief, you have to have acquaintance with the concepts? How can you have acquaintance with an infinite number of instantiations of a concept?
So why would you have? I don't see why you would need infinite. Why would you need acquaintance with infinite instantiations of it?
Well, because if you don't have an acquaintance with all instances of it, you don't know if it applies in all instances.
Now, that assumes an empiricism, but that begs the question against analyticity, which says that a necessary truth is something that you can know without having to verify it empirically. So, for example,
Well, how do
if
you
I
know
want to
such
say,
beliefs exist?
such as such as necessary truths.
Well, how do you
You're
know
asking how I know that necessary truths
truths?
exist?
Yeah.
Because I'm directly acquainted with them.
Wait, but you started this argument by talking about direct acquaintance, so aren't you reasoning circularly now?
How would I be reasoning circularly?
Because you started your justification by saying, well,
Hey David,
I have to have direct
you
acquaintance.
can't ask him questions. Let's make sure we keep that in mind when we're doing this cross examination.
I think he was asking it rhetorically, Marlon.
All right, no doubt.
He was asking if I was reasoning. He was asking if I was reasoning in a circle by somehow because I talked about direct acquaintances before. I wasn't following how it was that he thought I was reasoning in a circle. So it was a clarifying question.
Well, yeah. So you started out by saying, well, I can know that laws of logic are true because I have direct acquaintance with them. Well, how do you know that the laws of logic are an analytical truth? Well, because I know them by direct acquaintance. Well, that's a circular argument.
I don't think that is the case. If I say you're asking, it's like asking the same question twice and getting the same answer. You're asking, how do I know the laws of logic are true? By direct acquaintance. And so, it sounds like you asked the same question again. So, of course, you're going to get the same answer, that it's by direct acquaintance.
Okay, so what I'm asking is, so you say you can know the laws of logic because you have direct acquaintance with them. Well, how do you know they apply everywhere? Well, because they're analytic. Well, how do you know they're analytic? Well, I have a direct.
So if I was unclear before, because it sounded like this is how you put the argument to me, is that you said that I was directly acquainted with the laws of logic, and then you're asking how it is that I know that they're true. And I said, oh, well, they're analytic. And so you say, well, how do you know they're analytic? And I said, by direct acquaintance. Was that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So does the circularity of it make sense now?
If I said that, then I missaid it there. So I don't have direct acquaintance with the laws of logic. I have direct acquaintance with the concepts that make up the laws of logic. And then from those concepts, I'm able to understand that logical laws are analytic. That would be the correct order there. So I apologize if I said I was directly acquainted with the law of logic. A law of logic. That would be incorrect.
Right. So you have direct acquaintance with the concepts. How do you know that those concepts apply in all instances?
Well, I mean, what do you mean when you say a concept applies in all instances?
Well, we're talking about whether the laws of logic are true and apply everywhere. You're saying, oh, I don't have direct acquaintance with the laws of logic themselves. I have direct acquaintance with the concepts. Okay, well, that seems like it's begging the question. You're saying, well, I just have acquaintance with the concepts. Okay, that's kind of the same answer. You have direct acquaintance with them. Well, how do you have direct acquaintance with them? Well, they're analytic. Well, how do you know they're analytic? Well, I have direct acquaintance with them. It's just as circular as you accuse me of being.
I didn't say the concepts were analytic. I said laws of logic, which are made up of concepts with which I have direct acquaintance, are analytic. Does that clarify it?
Okay, but how do you know they're analytic? You then say I have direct acquaintance with them. Well, how do you have direct acquaintance with something that's true everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not understanding like the true everywhere part, right? So let's take this to like an example of a married bachelor, right? Do I need to
Okay.
have directly experienced every bachelor on the planet in order to know that every bachelor is unmarried? I don't think I need to do that. That's what truth in virtue of meaning means. It means I don't have to have the experience in order to know that it's true. So the same case with the laws of logic. Just in virtue of knowing what it means to be a contradiction, right? That means that there's incompatibility between two different ideas or beliefs or propositions. I know that there's incompatibility there. I know what it means to be incompatible. So if one obtains, the other does not. If they both obtain, by definition, they are not incompatible. So there's not going to be a contradiction there. I don't have to have like gone out and experienced every fact in the world to know that. I just have to know what it means to be incompatible in the same way that I just have to know what it means to be a bachelor to know that there are no married bachelors, because if someone's married, guess what? They're not a bachelor.
Right. So that means that if I defined contradictions as being analytically true, you couldn't prove me wrong.
Well, you don't really define something as being analytically true. That's kind of like
well, that's what you just did with bachelors.
I didn't define it as being analytically true. Do you disagree that the meaning of bachelor is an unmarried man?
No, I agree that that's the definition. It's an analytical truth. I'm simply saying by your approach, I could define contradictions as true analytically. And since you don't have acquaintance with every instance of the laws of logic, you couldn't prove that I'm wrong in your approach.
Well, notice that I did not define. I didn't define it. I didn't say it is like I didn't make the definition of bachelor. It is true that there are no unmarried men, right? There's a correspondence between the definition and the meaning there, and so that therefore any instantiation of a bachelor necessarily is going to be an unmarried man, because if it wasn't, then again, wouldn't be a bachelor. So when you say I don't have a way to prove it to you, I mean, in a sense, that is true, right? The whole idea of direct acquaintance is that this is first person, this is personal. So I have direct acquaintance with my concepts, right? If someone else doesn't have that, you're right, they're not going to have the justification. So this is a radically first-person approach to epistemology. I have justification, first-person justification, analytic justification for believing that logical laws are true. But you're right, I couldn't prove that to you.
Okay, so yeah, that's something that's come up in discussions we've had before. You've stated that you can't prove, I think in your terminology, you can't prove, there's some things that you can't prove to other people. Let me see if I can find it. How do you know your version of justify is the same for anyone else but you?
I mean, I again go back to the definition of the word. I mean, if we're using the word in a different way to mean justify in a different way, then I mean, yeah, then it's not going to apply to different people.
Okay, well, in the response you've given me before, you said, I don't. I'm perfectly open to different accounts of epistemic justification. So far, I haven't seen anything other than classical foundational which actually works, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be another option. Well, your approach, I think, is just radically solipsistic. I mean, you, for example, how do you know that, you know, you have these concepts of laws of logic. How do you know that that everything is an illusion, as in Hinduism? You know, you have direct experience, a direct acquaintance with facts, but how would you actually prove that its reality isn't just one big illusion or Maya, as Hindus hold?
Yeah, so I would want to first make clear from the start that I don't believe that knowledge requires certainty. So a belief doesn't have to be certain in order to count as knowledge. It can be true probabilistically. I do think we need certainty at the foundations, and so that's why I argued for an infallibilist understanding of the foundations of knowledge, and that is key to classical foundationalism, is that you can't be a fallibilist. You can't think that all beliefs are false. But beyond the foundations, I don't think that certainty translates transfers up. So any inferential belief that I hold is only going to, the justification for it is only going to be as good as the evidence that I have for it. And so in that case, when we're specifically talking about how do I get outside of my own head, as it were, how do I know that there's an external world, this is going to be through inference to the best explanation, right? So we got a few hypotheses. So like we've got real external world hypothesis. We've got that everything is an illusion caused by, I don't know what. You could be, a brain in a vat, right? I could be a scientist. So we've got these hypotheses. And so, we explore them. Which one has the most explanatory power, which one is the simplest, and it's my conclusion from that external world hypothesis has it's the simplest, and on the basis of confirmation theory, it's the most well confirmed. So I think I have not certain knowledge of an external world, but I think I have probabilistic justification for believing in an external world. All
right, that's time right there.
Okay. Oh, okay.
All right, David, you're up for your 10-minute cross-examination of Seth.
Okay, we did. I brought this up in my response, but I would like to kind of press you on it. You do accept the justified true belief definition of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then maybe you can help me understand this statement. You make this distinction between the proximate and the ultimate sources of knowledge, and then if it has to be if a belief has to be justified in order to count as knowledge, then what is it that is justifying knowledge gained via the proximate source?
So I would make a distinction between something that's proximately justified and ultimately justified. It goes back to a famous quote by Van Til where he says that unbelievers often they can count, and they often count better than believers can. But what they can't do is account for their counting. So if I was, I read math books, and I know I've read math books written by, some of them been written by believers, some of them been written by unbelievers.
Seth, look like we lost you again, man. So if you want to log back in. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I'm back.
You're talking about math books by believers and unbelievers.
Yes, math books. So the proofs, I would say that they are approximately justified in the sense of we can do a reductio ad absurdum proof to prove the existence of a certain mathematical object. That is proximately justified, but I would distinguish and say it's not ultimately justified because the unbeliever does not have a worldview in which they can make intelligible the procedure of logical deductions.
All right, so I want to be charitable in my interpretation there, because on the face of it, it sounds like a contradiction, right? You're saying it is justified, but it's also not justified. So I want to see kind of what does that mean.
It is approximately justified. It's not ultimately justified.
What's the difference between proximate and ultimate justification?
Well, it has to do with the difference between a presupposition and a non-presuppositional belief. So somebody can have a belief, if even of just any mundane instance of sense perception, somebody might look at an unbeliever and I can both look at a Toyota and say, oh, look at the symbol, look at the shape of the car, it's a Toyota. Now, we both have a justification proximately in the sense that he used his sense perception correctly. I used my sense perception correctly. He does not have a worldview in which he can make intelligible sense of the procedure of using sense perception. So if he was Hindu, he would say, oh, that's a Toyota. And I would say, well, yeah, it is a Toyota. I can explain why I know it's a Toyota, but you can't. You used your sense perception, but you're a Hindu, so you also believe that everything's an illusion. And the Upanishads explicitly say that there is no difference between true and false. It's an illusion. So he can't say that it's true that it's a Toyota. He doesn't have a worldview in which logical distinctions adhere. So he sees, the most he could say is, he sees the illusion of a Toyota, but even that much he couldn't really say because he could also say that's the illusion of a non-Toyota.
Okay, so what this sounds like to me, I'm trying to put this in my, the way I understand things. In epistemology, there's a distinction between conditional justification and decisive justification. So conditional justification would be Like my belief is justified if something else is the case, right? So to kind of use your example there, his belief would be that the Toyota would be justified if he was holding to the Christian worldview. Would that be fair?
That sounds fair, yeah.
Okay, so conditional versus decisive. That's what we mean by proximate versus ultimate. Because decisive means there's no undischarged conditional. The belief is just justified. There's no if.
Well, we can go with that, yeah.
Okay. That's language I understand right there. So, what then? All right, I think we already did that. So, I kind of want to talk then about, kind of given presuppositionalism, how do you justify these beliefs in deduction and induction, right? Because these have got to be decisively justified at some point, right? We can't have ifs all the way down.
Right.
We've got to have terminal justification somewhere. So you believe in deduction
Right.
and induction. You think that these are truth-preserving inference forms. And so you say that by presupposing the existence of the Christian God, that somehow gives you decisive justification. Why doesn't that just create more unjustified beliefs? Because now you got to explain how your belief in God is justified, and you've got to explain how it is that, logic corresponds to his ways of thinking, what justifies that belief, and then what justifies the belief that he keeps nature uniform. Seems like you've got 3 unjustified beliefs.
Well, no, they're perfectly justified, but what it comes down to is examining the concrete. I'm on the diving board. I know I'm standing up, but I just have to look at the concrete better. So I have to read the Bible better. There are passages such as the passage right after the flood, and I believe in Jeremiah 30, that explicitly talk about the regularity of nature. There are passages that witness to God being in charge of nature and controlling it and ruling it in a regular and providential way. As far as deduction, so that deals with the uniformity of nature and induction. As far as deduction goes, one of the tests of a prophet is whether he contradicted prior revelation. God says in various places, promises in Christ are not yes and no, or there is no shadow due to change. He's a rational God, so he commands us to reason. Well, there have to be rules to this reasoning. Unbelievers can happen to find correct rules to reasoning, like Aristotle did. But God himself is rational. He expects us to be rational. He commands us to be rational. And he's given us organs that allow us to use our sense perception and our reasoning in ways that correspond with reality.
Okay, now those beliefs seem to be conditionally justified then. Your belief in deduction and induction are justified if the Bible is true. So then what justifies that belief?
One thing I would want you to keep in mind is that it's not the justification of one. It's not the ultimate justification of just one belief. So the Christian worldview is a network of beliefs that's justified. So we're not justifying just one belief. We're justifying an entire unit of beliefs or worldview or total. We're justifying a total picture of reality. And basically, what it comes down to, and I can give you examples if you want. It's by the impossibility of the contrary. If you try to explain it on an atheist, in an atheist worldview, Islamic worldview, Hindu worldview, whatever, you undercut your ability to justify any belief whatsoever.
Are you familiar with the work of Michael R. Butler?
Yes, I am, to some degree.
Okay, well, in his chapter, The Transcendental Argument, in the book, The Standard Bearer, A Fish Rift for Greg L. Bonson, he deals with sort of the problem that I would want to raise for the account that you just gave there, right? You must say, oh, well, these other worldviews can't do it. Great, I don't care. That doesn't mean that your worldview can't. So just eliminating other, options, it doesn't mean that yours is justified. And this is what Butler has to say to this problem. Butler says, it seems to me that the best that the presuppositionalists can do at this point is to argue that the most likely explanation for the fact that the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition for experience is that Christianity is true. But notice that even if it is granted that this is the most likely explanation, the arguments for God's existence is reduced to one of probability claim. End quote. Do you have something better than that to offer me, or is Butler right? That's the best you guys can do?
I'm actually a little surprised to find that Butler said that. I've read some of his stuff, and Van Til and Bahnsen made very clear claims that the proofs of the Christian worldview are not probabilistic; they are objective and certain. So I do believe that the proof for God's existence is objective and certain. Did you want an example?
Well, I want to know what's your solution then to this problem, because that's Butler's solution to the problem that I'm raising, that just because these other worldviews can't do it, this is no proof that your worldview can. So I want to know how the Christian worldview justifies my belief in deduction, induction. Saying other people can't do it, guess what? Doesn't mean yours can. So how is yours doing it?
Okay. Well, as far as justifying deduction and induction, I mean, I justified by the answer I just gave. But as far as the world,
well, you conditionally justified it. It was conditioned.
Right.
It's only justified if the Bible's true.
Right. And if the Bible isn't true, if any other worldview is true, then you can't even justify your claim that the Bible isn't true.
You're right. I'm not claiming it isn't. I'm wanting to know what's the justification that it is. Because again, saying other worldviews don't work, that doesn't show me that the Bible's true.
Okay, part of it has to do with the inescapability of a worldview. There's no space you can walk into where you can rationalistically look at all worldviews simultaneously and, without a worldview yourself. And, I mean, the whole process of analyzing and critiquing two different worldviews presupposes that you have a worldview back of that analysis by which you're doing the critiquing. So you simply can't escape having a worldview at all. And one of the things that the Bible reveals is that we do know God. We know he exists. We simply deny that. We simply deceive ourselves into believing that we don't believe in his existence. So true, that's, it's not an inductive argument where, oh, this one's false, this one's false, this one's false. Oh, the last one left is Christianity. It's not an inductive argument like that. It has to do with the inescapability of having a worldview, and that no other worldview. One part of the answer would be it's revealed to us. It's revealed to us by God that there is no other answer.
All right, guys. Okay, that concludes your 10 minutes, David. You guys had that 20-minute open discussion now. So if you guys want to continue on this trail of questioning, then you guys can. You got 20 minutes.
Yeah, why don't we keep going on that thread? I think it was useful.
Yeah. So, kind of, here's the thing that you say. You say, oh, well, God reveals it to us, but he does that in the Bible, which, remember, it's conditionally justified. Right. I want the decisive justification. I want to know what that concrete is in your perspective, right? I mean, I provided that in my opening, right? I mean, I've got the concrete, I've got direct acquaintance, but I'm not seeing what that is for the presuppositionalist, because saying it comes back to, oh, well, a worldview is inescapable, doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, here's what Greg Bahnsen said about being locked inside of a worldview. He said, strictly speaking, this is only an indication that we are bound to think in certain patterns. This does not tell us anything about the truthfulness or appropriateness of those patterns. Perhaps we are locked into a distorted mindset. Now, I think he's right there. I mean, what answer can he's good at raising these objections, but my problem with Bahnsen is he doesn't show how he gets out of it.
Okay, I guess at this point I'm not understanding how I haven't answered your question. I would take the approach that, one thing that Romans 1 says is that all things in creation reveal the existence of God. So we're not just, brains in a vat doing thinking. God's existence is revealed to us with certainty through all of creation. So in a sense, our default position is Christianity is true, but because of total depravity, we're sinners, and we deny that we believe in God. So without sin, our default position would be to presuppose God's existence in everything that we do.
Okay, but if you're going to go back then to natural revelation, I mean, that's perfectly compatible with the thesis I've defended. I agree that God gives us natural revelation in nature. That's what evidential apologetics is all about. We point to the evidence in nature. If you're going to say that's where you're getting your decisive justification for your beliefs is, oh, well, it's through natural revelation, then, I mean, that's evidentialism.
Well, at some level, it does become an authority claim. It's true because God says it. He
Okay,
exists
how do you know?
because he exists because he does. He exists because we know that he exists because he's revealed his existence to us in natural revelation and special revelation. So at some level, it is an authority claim. How I know that it's true is that it comes from the authority of God himself. And I know that all other competing claims are false because they're internally contradictory.
But how do you know that this one comes from God? Just because it's not internally contradictory, that doesn't entail that it came from God.
Well, it came from God because God wrote the Bible. God's a Trinity. He reveals himself to be a Trinity in the Bible. Because I don't question God's authority.
You know it through the Bible because the Bible said so?
God's authority is absolutely unquestionable, period.
Okay, well, I'm asking for the justification. This isn't about authority. I'm asking what's the justification?
The justification is that God is infallible and is correct and has revealed it to us.
How do you know?
Because he's God and he exists and he's infallible. He told us.
See how this comes back? But see, that only counts. What he's telling you only counts if those things that he's telling you about himself are true, right? Like if I say this guy who's wearing mismatched socks told me that everything that a person wearing mismatched socks says is true. So that means that whatever someone wearing mismatched socks says is true because a guy wearing mismatched socks told me so. You know, that's the problem with circular justification.
Yeah, but the mismatched socks guy isn't infallible. God is.
Oh, well, he told me he was.
Well, can he do? Well, okay. If he says that he's infallible, then he's claiming to be either a prophet or apostle. And one of the tests for a prophet or apostle is, can they do a miracle? So if he says he's infallible, I want to see him turn water to wine.
Is true. Only if your Bible is true, but that's conditionally justified. It's only justified if God is infallible. Oh, well, so is what this guy with the mismatched socks is telling me.
Here's the thing. So it's not that I have an authority claim and you have a non-authority claim. You have an authority claim just like I do. You presuppose the direct acquaintance approach to knowledge, where you just claim over and over, I have direct acquaintance and this is what I know.
Right.
But the problem is that your approach, again, is internally contradictory. I don't really see any difference between your direct acquaintance approach and empiricism. And of course, empiricism doesn't have any basis for justifying the laws of logic, and you can't reason without the laws of logic.
Well, I explicitly denied empiricism in my opening statement when I made a case for a priori knowledge. I mean, that's literally the antithesis of empiricism.
You stated you were against it. I didn't see any substantive difference between the two, though.
Did you not hear my case that I believe that all bachelors are unmarried without having to examine each and every bachelor, that I can know that a priori? That's a rationalist position. That is explicitly at odds with empiricism, which says that all knowledge comes through the senses.
Well, I would go back to what Kant's problem with empiricism and rationalism is that on their own, neither one can justify really anything. He was convinced of Hume's empiricist approach, which said that if empiricism is true, you can't know anything. If you take a rationalist approach where you can only deal in the certainty of analytical truths, well, then you don't really have a basis to know that those analytical truths apply to any facts. As Anthony Flew once put it, if you have, putting together two leaky buckets, you still have a leaky bucket. You don't have... if you have two leaky epistemologies and you put them together, you're still going to have one big leaky epistemology.
Well, where's the leak in rationalism?
You don't have any actual political truths actually apply in all places. You can just claim that, it's analytically true that the laws of, a statement can't be true and false at the same time. Well, do you have acquaintance with all statements? Can't really know that's true.
Let's talk a little bit about what you mean by prove there then. Yes, certainly I can't prove it in the sense of I can't publicly show it to someone, but that doesn't mean I don't have justification for it. If you're just going to say, oh, well, you can't know that it applies in all places at all times, that immediately begs the question against analyticity, because it assumes that the only way to verify these things is through having actually experienced the things. But that is totally question begging against analyticity, not against.
That seems to be your position, is that you can't justify something unless you have direct acquaintance with it.
Well, at the foundational level, yes.
By the analyticity of something. I mean, again, sure. I think it goes back to the circularity. You talk about direct acquaintance. That's how you justify things. I have direct acquaintance with it. Well, how do you know that the direct acquaintance with the concepts of the laws of logic are true? Oh, well, they're analytically true. Well, how do you know that they're analytically true? Well, I have direct.
So I'm not saying that the concepts are analytically true, right? I'm saying that the propositions of logical laws are made up of concepts, and that I have direct acquaintance with those concepts. So it's not that I've got so the statement, the logical law, that's analytically true. How do you know? Well, because I understand the concepts that are making it up. That's the definition of analyticity, right? It's true in virtue of meanings. So I've got direct acquaintance there. And so that's where the justification comes in. The direct acquaintance is with the concepts. The concepts make up the proposition, and the proposition is analytically true.
Okay, well, how do you know the concepts adhere in all times and all places?
Oh, they may not. They don't have to. For example, I think
right,
I have.
Exactly. So you don't have justification for them. That's what brings your epistemology to a screeching halt. Is that you can only the most you could even try to do is claim that the concepts of logic are true in my personal experience. You don't know if they're true beyond your own experience, which of course means you don't know if they're true there for other people. You don't know if they were true before you were born, and after you die, you don't know if they'll continue being true. So your epistemology really doesn't do anything for you. That's what I mean, is that any non-revelational epistemology, even yours, is internally contradictory. It doesn't actually prove what it sets out to prove.
Well, nothing about what you said shows that it's internally contradictory. If even granted that, it would show that I don't get justification for the universal applicability of the law of non-contradiction. But nothing about what you said would show that anything about my epistemology was self-contradictory. Second, as I think we just showed in the cross-examination, I don't think that you have any justification in your revelational epistemology. But what I meant by that when I was saying, well, for the reasons that, we went over there, is that you kept going back to this, oh, well, he revealed it to me. Oh, well, how do you know? Because he's infallible. How do you know he's infallible? Because he revealed it to me. Well, how do you know, that revelation is true? Well, because he's infallible. So we kept going back on this circle, and we never got the...
Hold on. I'm just using functional circular reasoning, which makes it okay.
No, that would be epistemically circular reasoning.
No. I'm calling it functional, and apparently we can do that.
Well, there is an actual difference between functional circularity and justificatory circularity, or rather, between a functional usage and a justificatory usage. So this isn't about types of circularity. This is about types of usage.
Okay, well, explain to me why I can't just say, well, okay, fine, you have your circularity with this one weird exception called functional circularity. Okay, then you don't have a problem with certain kinds of circular reasoning, so you don't have a problem with presuppositionalism.
It's not circularity. It's usage. I apologize. I did say functional circularity. I meant functional usage. So when you are, I'll give an example to make it easier. So for example, let's say that we're having a debate over the existence of pencils. All right. Let's say that we're having this debate by means of letters, and I'm giving you a syllogistic argument to believe in the existence of pencils. Now, suppose that to write that argument out, I used a pencil. Okay, well, no premise in that argument depends on the conclusion that pencils are actually real. So there's no justificatory circularity. The argument is perfectly linear. It's valid. It's sound. But functionally, I used a pencil. So I used the pencil functionally in the defense of itself, but I did not use the pencil in a justificatory sense. So it's not circular because it's not saying pencils, therefore pencils.
Okay, so when it comes to how Aristotle proved the existence of the laws of logic, would you say that's a justificatory sense or a functional sense?
Justificatory. Aristotle's argument is it's circular and it's completely fallacious.
Oh, you actually think it's fallacious? I didn't realize that. What
Well,
makes it fallacious according to you?
So there's a few problems with it. I'll just give three here. But first of all, I would say it's transcendental, so it doesn't really establish that the laws of logic are true. It just establishes that, you have to think that way. Okay, but as Bonson said, that doesn't prove that they're true. Second, it's a circular argument because it's basically saying if you deny the laws of logic, then you're contradicting yourself. But that's only a problem if the laws of logic are true. So it's not actually giving us any reason to think that they're false. And then third, it's not going to work against dialetheism. Dialetheists say some contradictions are true, but not all. And Aristotle's argument is only going to work if you apply it to all instances of contradictions.
Gotcha. Well, let's see. What have we kind of wandered from the concept of autonomy, and I'd like to return to that. Your statement, human beings can attain knowledge without special revelation. You said basically that's what you believe autonomy to be. Is that correct?
Well, based on Bonson's definition, that would be an autonomous position.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe we don't have to go over that. Let's see, what else was there that we missed? One thing I wanted to ask is you did mention Bernoulli's theorem, and I was wondering if you know, can you tell me what the axioms of that produce Bernoulli's theorem are?
The thing is, I'm not great with the arithmetic here, so a lot of that kind of came out of Donald Williams' book, The Ground of Induction. He goes through it in detail. I think it has something to do with the law of large numbers, which is it's like one interpretation of like a theorem? Right. And so people who really want all of it, I'm just going to point you Donald Williams' book, The Ground of Induction, where he lays it all out. I think it's in the third or fourth chapter. But basically it's the law of large numbers, and it says that that sample populations, yes, a reasonably large sample population is going to differ only a little bit from the population as a whole.
Okay, I was hoping to chase that. Oh, Marlon?
What you got?
Oh, sorry, Marlon. I thought you were going to say something.
No.
Okay. So I'd like to go over what you said about rescuing Hume's skepticism. I'm fully convinced that Hume did show on an empiricist framework you can't know that nature's uniform. I was wondering if you could give more detail why you think that that's not true.
I would actually agree with it on empiricist grounds that, you would have no way of justifying an inductive inference. My position depends on the validity of something like deduction, which I don't think can be an empiricist, I guess, could justify it. Let me think about this. So you could use the second argument I gave for the laws of logic as an empiricist, and then maybe you could use induction that way. I don't know. It almost seems like it's using induction to prove induction. Basically, the solution I gave was not empiricist, though. I gave a rationalist solution to the problem of induction.
Oh, okay. Well, but rational laws are something that you couldn't account for in an empiricist framework anyway.
Well, you could through the second argument I gave, but it would not be with it wouldn't be with certainty. It would only be like a probabilistic thing. And so, you're like multiplying, you're not going from certainty to probability. You're going from like probability with more probability. So certainly it would have to at least shake your confidence in an inductive inference if you're like a thoroughgoing empiricist. So I would agree with you there.
Gotcha. Honestly, I think we've pretty much covered all of the areas of disagreement that we have, I think. The only other thing I can think of is having you talk about classical foundationalism and why you think that actually works. That's all I can think of.
Why do you think it doesn't?
Notes. What's that?
Why do you think it doesn't work?
I'm pretty convinced by Plantinga's refutation of it, which it's been a little while since I read his book, but basically it came down to the criterion for beliefs in classical foundationalism. The standards for truth are basically self-refuting.
I can read his argument if you want.
Sure.
All right, so classical foundationalism says that all beliefs, either they have to be incorrigible or they have to be justified on the evidential basis of beliefs that are incorrigible. And Alvin Plantinga argues that classical foundationalism itself, it's not incorrigible and it's not justified on the evidential basis of beliefs that are, so it's self-referentially incoherent. Is that the argument you're referring to?
Yeah.
Did you see?
That sounds familiar now.
Did you see the video that I tagged you in when I made it called Foundationalism Defended? That was the first argument I addressed.
I did not, I don't think.
Okay, so I'm going to agree with Plantinga that foundationalism itself is not incorrigible. Where I disagree with him is I say that classical foundationalism can be justified, at least in principle, on the evidentiary basis of beliefs that are incorrigible. So if you have another sort of belief that's not incorrigible, but is nonetheless capable of being a foundation, bring it. If you got that, classical foundationalism is dead, I will admit it. But Plantinga, he offers his theory of proper function. I did a whole video arguing why, I don't think his theory works. So if these alternatives of basic beliefs aren't working, then we've got at least some kind of justification for thinking that only the incorrigible beliefs are going to do it. And so that's what classical foundationalism says. So as long as we only have incorrigible beliefs working as a foundation, it's not going to be self-refuting. You need to identify another sort of belief.
Well, but then it brings to the question of what is allowed to count as an incorrigible belief.
Well, incorrigibility, it's the property of propositions that are not subject to being corrected, reformed, or improved. So that's what the definition of an incorrigible belief is.
Different people will differ on what exactly counts as that. If you ask an empiricist, only empirical observations are incorrigible. If you ask, a Muslim, only their beliefs in the Quran are incorrigible, etc. So I don't think that actually answers the question.
All right.
I'm sorry, Marlon.
You're good, man. No worries, man. We have expired. Cross-examination is over and done with, man. Good job, guys. The audience appreciates your candor and the way you guys are approaching each other. All right, so we're gonna transition to the closing remarks and then the Q&A. So, audience, make sure you get those questions in so we can challenge these guys, man. And make them answer hard questions. All right, Seth, you're up for your 5-minute closing, man.
Okay, well, this has been a good debate. I appreciate David coming on and having a discussion. I appreciate Marlon hosting it. I really do think that debates like this are helpful. I don't think that classicalists and presuppositionalists should just sit in their ivory towers and shout at each other. It does take work to work through what do you believe, what do I believe, where are our specific differences, where are some areas of agreement. So hopefully, I think this was helpful. I hope it was helpful to the audience. But I still don't think, I'm not convinced that David established his position. He does state his version of autonomy as human beings can attain knowledge without special revelation. Well, depending on what you mean by that, I still admitted that that's possible. Do I need to read my Bible in order to understand a math proof? Can I be an unbeliever and justify in approximate sense a math proof? Well, sure. But what autonomy demonstrates is that you cannot have a justification for those beliefs, an ultimate justification. You can't have an ultimate justification for your proximate justifications. You're counting. David, I don't think answered the challenge there. And second of all, I don't think his worldview really answers the question in that, I think I showed that his epistemology doesn't really work. He starts off saying, well, I know things by direct acquaintance. Then he shifts to a rationalist position where he says, well, we know things by analyticity. Well, then how do you know that analytic truths apply everywhere? Well, I have acquaintance with them. He seems to be bouncing between an empiricist position and a rationalist position, and as Kant famously pointed out, neither of those work. So if you just bounce between them, you don't have a workable epistemology. So I still believe that my position is correct. I don't think David answered the challenge, but hopefully for the audience, it still clarified what we believe, what we don't believe, and it can be a useful tool to help Christians work through these issues charitably.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Seth, for that closing statement. All right, David, you're up for your closing remarks, and you got it for 5 minutes, man.
All right, thanks, Marlon, and thanks, Seth. It was a really good conversation. I do enjoy discursing, with you. We're alike in that we're both very passionate about our beliefs, but I appreciate that, we can have a respectful discussion like this. I think it was profitable. I think we covered a lot of ground, and so, thanks for a great conversation. I just kind of review some of the points here and maybe kind of give a few last responses. I just want to reemphasize that this distinction he makes between proximate sources of knowledge and ultimate sources of knowledge, it's very misleading, because the proximate source, if you don't have justification, you don't have knowledge. And so the proximate source, it's not a proximate source of knowledge. I don't know what it's a source of, but it seems like it's just not a source of anything. And then when we get down to this ultimate source, I want to just reemphasize, we never got decisive justification there. It was always, oh, well, God is infallible. How do you know? Because he told me so. Oh, well, that only matters if he's infallible, right? Well, he told me so. So that's the justification for it. We just kind of like go down this loop, like where does the justification terminate? And it just does it in presuppositionalism. And so that's really my big problem with it, is it does not justify beliefs. And so anyone who's interested in having knowledge, justify true beliefs, should reject a system that is principally incapable of giving you any justification, and that is presuppositionalism. Now, this idea of acquaintance came up, and so just kind of want to talk about it a little bit. It's not circular. It's a direct connection to reality. You're true. I can't prove to anyone that I am, directly acquainted with a certain fact. It's first person. I have acquaintances. So, those serve to justify beliefs for me. And, the best way, I think, for someone to realize that they have acquaintance is, you just maybe pinch yourself. You'll be acquainted with pain. So, acquaintances are first person. Now, I gave two arguments for logic. He kind of argued that the first one was circular and that the second one didn't really work. The first one, as I argued, that logic is analytic. And so that was not an explanation for why it's justified. I want to be clear on that. Analytic explains why it's true. Analyticity means you have truth in virtue of meaning. Now, that's one issue, is how is it that an analytic proposition is true? And that is how it applies to all instances in reality. How is it justified is a distinct question, and it's justified by one's direct acquaintance with the concepts that make up the analytic statement. So there's two issues there. It's not circular in any way. It only becomes circular if you try to mix those together, then you can make it look circular. The second argument, we didn't discuss it much, but he kind of said, well, because you haven't been acquainted with absolutely every fact that's out there, then you don't know that the laws of logic apply to everything. Well, that assumes that certainty is a requirement for knowledge, but I reject that. We can have probabilistic justification. I gave an abductive argument. Abductive arguments do not give you certainty. That's the nature of an abductive argument. And so that second argument, yes, it does give you justification. And no, even if there were contradictions out there, right? Let's say that we did come across something that was a contradiction. That wouldn't refute the argument, as long as most things that we come across are are non-contradictory, then we would still have justification, maybe not in believing in a law of non-contradiction, but we could believe in it, in a similar way to that we gauge indeterminate probabilities in other areas. We didn't touch on the issue of induction very much, and admittedly, I mean, induction is not an easy topic. I just want to refer people to Donald Williams' book there, The Ground of Induction, and that one's a little hard to find, so maybe look up Timothy McGrew's paper. I think it's called Direct Inference in the Problem of Induction. That paper's a little more technical, but you can get it for free online off of his website, and he gives pretty much an updated version of Williams' solution to the problem of induction. And so kind of just in closing, let me end with a quote by Timothy McGrew, because this pretty much sums up my sentiments about presuppositionalism. Timothy McGrew says, "It is painful to have to point out things like this, since Van Til inspired so many ardent and loyal disciples. But in my view, deep problems pervade almost every area of Van Til's thought. His epistemology, his history of philosophy, his descriptions of the positions of non-believers, and his exegesis of scripture. It is my considered opinion that there is no point trying to correct his system piece by piece. One must simply start over on very different principles."
All right. Thank you guys both for this great debate, man. Excellent job. And yeah, good stuff, man. And I think the audience, once again, enjoyed it. And now they get the chance to ask you guys some questions. So we're going to jump to this Q&A. So starting with the first one here. Should see it pop up on the bottom of the screen here.
Heard like the last 30 seconds of his response.
I defended you, Seth.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the comment was, David, he used a bait and switch on you. He said a Hindu can't know the car is a Toyota because of his worldview, but a Hindu can know it with his autonomous human reasoning. So,
and I said I thought that misunderstood what you were saying.
Yes, that misunderstands it. So, because his reasoning is autonomous, he would not be able to give an ultimate justification for his belief in sense perception. But if we assume for the moment that sense perception gives us truth, then sure, he can use the sense perception to learn the proximate truth and have proximate justification for believing that the car is a Toyota. But he has a worldview in which there is no ultimate justification for any belief.
All right. Here, let me see. All right, let me see if I get a question for you, Seth. All right.
Sorry about my shoddy connection. I don't know what's going on tonight that's making that happen so often.
It's all right. It's technology, man. Here's a question for both of you. From Chuck.
Okay.
Thank you, Chuck, for the question. Why is this discussion needed or important? And do you guys have any suggestions on any books to understand more about this topic?
So part of it, well, actually, David, why don't if you want to go, you can.
All right. I mean, I think the topic is important because this is, I think knowledge is important. And this question kind of gets down, as you probably noticed, to the very foundations of knowledge. How are beliefs justified? And, as that relates to our Christianity, how do we know that our Christian beliefs, our religious beliefs are justified? And I think that's important. And so, at least for me, I think the presuppositionalist answer is very badly flawed and is, giving people a false confidence and, by using arguments that, as I tried to show in my opening statement, really can't be answered. And so that's not the way that we should try to, defend our faith to other people. That shouldn't be the reason that we hold to Christianity, because I think it's a faulty foundation. I think evidentialism does provide us with that good, solid foundation. And so that's going to affect really everything, because how you think you know things, that affects every area of life, including, your Christian life, how you share your faith with others. So it's incredibly practical in a certain sense, because practicality is always going to get back to here like everything does. Regarding books, a really good book just to kind of get into the debate is It just came out last year. It's called Debating Christian Religious Epistemology. Really good introduction to this issue. It's got a presuppositionalist, it's got a classical foundationalist contributor, and it's got a few others, and you really just get to explore the debate. If you're looking for something a little more academic, one of the most worthwhile books I ever read, Internalism and Epistemology by Timothy and Lydia McGrew. It's a little bit expensive, but it is totally worth it. It's got a devastating critique of circular reasoning, and I think I'm probably going too long. So over to you, Seth.
Okay. Well, I would say, first of all, I think it's worthwhile because it's worthwhile for Christians to tell the truth. Now, Christians have been converted by fallacious arguments. I used to think that the first cause argument and the teleological arguments were, just the coolest thing ever. But the more I read in philosophy, the more I realized that those arguments are actually really deeply flawed. I actually kind of relished reading David Hume and him just ripping the teleological argument apart. It is just shot through with all sorts of logical fallacies. So imagine you are at a revival, and because you wanted to encourage other people to make a decision for Christ, let's say you paid 10 people in the audience to walk forward and make a gestured profession of faith at the altar. They go down to the altar and they start weeping and they talk about forgiveness, and let's say you literally just paid them. Well, we would all say that that's morally horrendous Christian. I mean, it shouldn't be. Also, not just logically incorrect, but morally horrendous when we use argument. So they're simply Christians are required to tell the truth. The Bible says, "Come, let us reason together," and we're required to reason well instead of poorly. So this is a worthwhile debate to have about which method is actually correct, for the simple reason that Christians should be as consistently biblical as we can. It reminded me of some of the medieval relics. I remember reading John Calvin's account of all of the medieval relics, which were supposed to, engender piety in people. And he talked about how, the reformers would make jokes about how if you took all the pieces of the true cross, you could make a forest. There was a relic which was supposedly the brain of St. Peter. And when, I'm not sure if Calvin himself examined it, but somebody did, it turns out it was just pasteboard. And the justification for that kind of thing was, these are pious frauds. Well, I don't think being fraudulent is pious. I don't think reasoning inconsistently is pious. I don't think reasoning fallaciously is pious. So it simply comes down to tell the truth because God told us to.
All right. Cool. Thank you, guys. All right, here's another question for both of you guys can tackle. Is logic a creation of God or an attribute of God? Don't know who to ask, so ask both of you guys.
I would argue it's an attribute of God, but it's something that's, in a sense, embedded into creation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's an attribute of God. Kind of when you ask the question, what is logic? That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think it's something that's created, but I'm also not really like a Platonist, so I don't think it's like an abstract object either. My current position that I lean towards is known as nominalism, which I would say that logic is like, it's sort of something that's like part of everything else, but it doesn't exist as its own thing. But these are hard questions, and I mean, I really am okay with landing on like any of those issues. But yeah, I kind of lean towards nominalism, so I would say it's not something that's created. It is an attribute of God, and so therefore something that's reflected in creation.
All right. David, here's a question for you. And this one is, David, why think that these priori analytic propositions such as logic have anything to do with the world of contingent experience such that we can reason about the world using logic?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Somebody ran Bentel.
Monson, in fact, raises that same criticism, I believe, in his one of his diatribes against foundationalism. And the one point I think about analytic propositions is to realize that they are true even if they have no reference in the external world. So, for example, take my belief that a Pegasus is a winged horse. That's a true belief, but there are no Pegasuses, or I'm not sure what the plural Pegasus is. But anyway, there's no referent for that in the physical world, right? So it would be true that all bachelors are unmarried men, even if all of a sudden every single guy on the planet got married. So that's the idea of truth by definition. It's not contingent on something that's in the world, but it's something that cannot fail to correspond. So if there is something in the world to which this refers, then it's going to be true. So there don't have to be contradictions. Like, let's say there's no contradictions in the world. Law of non-contradiction is still true. If there are contradictions, law of non-contradiction is going to apply. So my answer is they don't have to apply to the actual world if there is nothing for them to refer to in the actual world. And they're still true. That's the nature of analytic propositions like the Pegasus. It's true without a referent. And so that's going to apply to logical truths as well.
All right, Seth?
Of the diatribes that I've read about, from Van Til and Bonson, honestly, I just find them convincing. And at some level, it seems like David is admitting it. He says, well, we don't know with certainty that they apply to the real world. Okay, well, if you want to play the knowledge game, I disagree that you can have knowledge in any sense without certainty. I mean, if you're not certain, that means you don't have justification. So if you want to play the knowledge game, if you want to have logic apply to anything, you have to have certainty that it applies. And David's admitted that he doesn't think that's possible. So that's why I've stated that his worldview doesn't work. It's internally contradictory because it claims to be. I think he has to inevitably claim to be certain, and then he admits that he can't be.
And to clarify, I did say I believe that certainty is possible at the foundations. I don't think it's necessary beyond the foundations.
All right.
Gotcha.
So, question for you, Seth. Did Cain have autonomous human reasoning in Genesis? This question is for Mr. Seth. For you, buddy.
Did Cain?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would say yes, because ultimately, your worldview in your metaphysics comes down to, do you believe in the creator-creature distinction? Well, one of the things, the New Testament actually comments on Cain and Abel, and it says, I can't remember which passage talks about it, but it basically says that the reason Cain's offerings were not accepted is because he didn't offer them in faith. Abel offered them in faith, Cain didn't, so Cain was doing some kind of, works righteous. Abel understood that he was simply offering gratitude for gracious salvation. Cain was trying to do some kind of works righteousness salvation. While that's not the kind of God that we worship. There's an infinite gap between creator and creature, and it's one that can't be bridged by means of works. So I would say yes. Ultimately, Cain was reasoning autonomously when he did what he did.
All right, David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone at least has the potential for autonomous reasoning, and I would say Cain was certainly employing it.
All right. All right, I have a question for you, David. For David, could the Bible be false?
All right, so this is a question that presuppositionalists will ask a lot, like, could it be false that Jesus rose from the dead? And it's really important to distinguish between the object level and the meta level here. So at the object level, reality is what it is, right? So at the object level, if Christianity is true, then no, the Bible could not be false. But can't confuse those two. At the meta level, I'm restricted to the evidence that I have. And so I don't have evidence. Seth thinks that he does. I don't think that I have evidence that guarantees that the Bible is true. So at the meta level, I have to be open to the possibility that it could be false. Now, that doesn't mean that only, if I'm 80% confident, that means only 80% of the Bible is true. So that's silly. Either the Bible is true or it is not. But when we're talking about my level of confidence or my level of justification for that, we're talking about the meta level. So at the object level, I don't believe it can be. But at the meta level, I have to remain open to the possibility that new evidence will come along.
All right, Seth?
My answer is yikes. I think that's a really I honestly think that's kind of a dangerous way to look at it. No, I don't think it's even possible that the Bible could be false, because, again, as I've stated throughout the debate, if the Bible's false, then any other worldview, if you try to replace it with any other worldview, it's internally contradictory, and you can't even justify the claim that the Bible's false. So it's when the Bible talks about the claims of Scripture, it talks about it. It never talks about probabilistic proofs. It talks about, in the book of Acts, Jesus showed them many infallible proofs. At the end of the book of John, he talks about, I'm writing these things to you so that you may have, I think the phrase he uses is full assurance. Well, he's writing that gospel to people who didn't witness physically, empirically, the resurrection of Jesus. It was a deposit, as Jude says, it's a deposit for the whole. It's a deposit for the whole church. So the motivation for the apostles to write what they did is so that we can have full assurance. Well, if there's even a possibility that they're wrong, we can't have full assurance. And if there's a possibility that we're wrong, then there's a possibility that God doesn't exist. It's possible we're not saved. And yet the Bible talks about having certainty of salvation and certainty of our convictions and certainty that Jesus rose from the dead.
All right. And here's a question. I think it's for you, Seth.
Okay.
Question for Stillman Smith. What's up, dude? How's it going, man? Is there a confusion of epistemology and ontology? Ontologically, the concrete needs to be there, but one doesn't need to assume the concrete epistemologically to stand on the dividing board.
Well, I can answer the first part of the question. Yeah, that's a very common objection to presuppositionalism. We're confusing epistemology with ontology. Of course, if God doesn't exist, then we wouldn't exist to have thoughts. That's not what we're saying. Must have at its foundation the belief in God. Otherwise, it all collapses and it doesn't work. So we're not confusing the two. We distinguish ontology and epistemology. Confuse the two. They are separate, but they're also related. As far as the diving board question, well, yeah, I actually made the point myself. We don't have to stand on the diving board. I should, when it comes to belief in God, we do know He exists, but we deny it. Make the straight across. Standing on the diving board really does know about the existence of the concrete, but they've deceived themselves into believing that there is no concrete. Concrete doesn't exist. I'm an atheist when it comes to concrete, and yet they still stand on the diving board, which is only held up because of the concrete.
All right. Let me see. Got some more questions here.
Can I comment on that, Marlon?
Oh yeah, my bad. Yeah, David, I'm sorry. Yeah, go for it, man.
You're good. You're good. By the way, what's up, Stillman? Good to see you, man. We need to talk again. But let's see. So I think that this is an interesting thing. I think like Van Til and Bahnsen, even Bahnsen. I prefer reading Bahnsen to Van Til, but they rely so heavily on like these illustrations that I think it really obscures their main points a lot of the time. So I don't think it's a good analogy at all. Like this diving board versus on the concrete thing. You'd say, oh well, you can still stand on the diving board even if you don't know about the concrete. Well, sorry, that's not how knowledge works. When we're talking about knowledge as in justified true belief, if you don't know why the belief is justified, you don't have knowledge. So it's just not relevant. It's not like, oh, you could believe this if you don't know. You could believe this and it could be knowledge, but you don't have to know what the justification is for. So like the diving board analogy, it's really bad, and so is the crackers in the pantry. Just about all the illustrations that presuppositionalists give are really horrible because they are just that. They're illustrations. And when we're talking about like analytic philosophy, I really prefer precision. And we don't get a lot of precision out of Van Til and Bahnsen, which is one reason it's really frustrating to read them. But beyond that, do presuppositionalists confuse ontology and epistemology? I think the answer here is yes and no. They don't, the ones who know what they're talking about. So like Chris Bolt is awesome. I love Chris Bolt. And he doesn't make those kinds of confusions. When you talk to like the people who just got into it online and they're like, oh, but God was needed. You couldn't be thinking if God wasn't there. Well, yeah, I also couldn't be thinking if my mom wasn't born. So, that's not necessary for me to have justification. So, yes, presuppositionalists at the popular level very frequently confuse ontology with epistemology, but there are smart guys who know what they're talking about, who actually understand presuppositionalism. And I would count Seth in there. I don't think Seth made that mistake in this debate. And so, I appreciate the people who have taken the time to understand the method and aren't making like really basic errors.
All right. Got a question for you, Seth.
Okay.
Are you claiming Christianity wins over other worldviews by default? Would you need to have an exhaustive set of worldviews to make the claim that all others are false?
In one sense, yes, I am saying that we win by default. I think it was in the Gordon Stein and Greg Bahnsen debate where Bahnsen made the point that even the fact that Stein showed up means that he's tacitly admitting that Christianity is true, because he's saying that the world is rational and we can have debates and it's possible to have the laws of logic. The question about an exhaustive list of worldviews, no. And there are various places where presuppositionalists will address this issue. I think there's an article several years ago I think it was by Doug Jones, in like the 90s. He wrote a response to this where basically what we're not arguing, we're not making an inductive statement. We're not saying worldview 1 is false, worldview 2 is false, on and on down the line. And we finally get to the last option, which is Christianity. And we're like, okay, that's the last option. All the others have been refuted. So it's the one that's true. Because even in the process of that analysis, before you even begin, you have to have some worldview by which you are doing the critique and analysis. And at that point, before you even start analyzing the first worldview, I would simply want to ask the person doing the analysis, okay, well, what worldview are you using to engage in this analysis? Inescapably, you have one. And yes, it is possible, for example, an empiricist might point out all the problems in Islam, and Islam might point out that empiricism is self-refuting and all that. And they might both be right, but then the question is, what worldview has to be at the back of both of those disagreements in order to say, okay, here's why we can know that empiricism is internally contradictory. Here's why we can know Islam is internally contradictory. What worldview is it that allows us to justify those analysis procedures?
Okay. David?
Yeah, so this is another interesting thing about presuppositionalists is they will say like, oh, we're not using God as a hypothesis. This isn't probabilistic. This is certain, They will make these kind of grandiose claims, but then they do seem to go like through this kind of deductive or rather this inductive like method of, oh, well, we're refuting other worldviews. I mean, like if it was really the case that everyone knew that the Christian worldview is true and that like they already were admitting that by showing up to debates and whatever these other kinds of claims are, I mean you wouldn't have to go through that kind of analysis, which I mean arguably shows that presuppositionalists know that that's just a claim that's not true. But that whole issue aside, about whether they are treating God as a hypothesis or not, I think more fundamentally what they mean by worldview is really what most of us would mean by epistemology. And so, yeah, you've got what's the epistemology that we're using in order to evaluate, other beliefs. And so presuppositionalists I think they're using the wrong terminology, but they're actually kind of right on that point that, everyone does have an epistemology, a theory of knowledge. And again, we don't have to know what that is consciously to kind of discover later what that is. And I think, we are all ultimately depending on those sort of basic incorrigible beliefs, which, I would want to identify as classical foundationalism. So I think there's a lot of confusion here with the terminology that precepts use.
All right. Here's a question for you, David. Is autonomous human reasoning a communicable attribute of God or an incommunicable attribute of God?
I guess I'd say it's a communicable attribute.
All right. Seth?
I would say no, because the question is kind of strange because autonomous human reasoning, well, God doesn't engage in human reasoning. He's not human. So, I would say no, and the question seems a little confused.
All right. And Seth, that's another question for you. How does the existence of logical principles imply the existence of a Christian God? Why couldn't these laws exist as absolutes present in nature?
Well, I would simply ask somebody to justify their claim that they just exist in nature. I mean, in one sense, I think that Aristotle's proof it does the job. In another sense, I would simply ask, okay, now that you've proven the inescapability of the laws of logic, what's behind the laws of logic that allows them to work, basically? Because somebody says, well, we can't think without the laws of logic. Well, as David pointed out, that doesn't really prove that they're true. That doesn't prove they exist. But it does prove that they're an inescapable category of thought. So basically, I would simply want to know more detail about, well, how else does this person know that some things are true? And then I would ask, well, for example, within empiricist epistemology, well, you can't know that the laws of logic are true everywhere. You can believe them if you want, but you can't justify your belief in them.
All right. David?
I want to note that there's a little bit of, goalpost shifting that goes on here. If the question is, you can't, if the claim of the presuppositionalist is, oh, you can't account for logic in your worldview. Well, this proposal that we've gotten right here, I mean, that shows that that's false. You could just say that they are Platonic objects that exist necessarily in an atheistic universe. Boom, you've accounted for them within atheism. So now notice what Seth does here is he goes, oh, well, let's say, what's the explanation for them? But notice how at that point you're going over to evidentialism. Evidentialists argue this way. We identify features of the world and then we seek God as the best explanation for them. And so, kind of the presuppositionalists, when they start, switching from kind of, oh, you can't account for this stuff to, oh, well, then you can't justify this stuff. There's almost like a switch over to evidentialism there, which I find kind of interesting.
All right. This is a final question, and it's for you, Seth. Final question.
Okay.
Why couldn't any standard view believing in a monotheistic God make the same claims such as I don't know. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. Baha'i, that claims that Christianity is just a part of a greater truth.
Oh boy. Well, the reason is I've studied most of the major religions. I've read the entire Bible a couple of times, or several times. I've read the Quran once. I've read the Book of Mormon once. I've read the Upanishads. I've read some amount of Greek philosophy, and it is simply a fact that not all religions define God in the same way. Not all religions argue the same way or make the same claims. It's simply an indisputable fact that the Quran claims God is Unitarian. It says over and over and over unequivocally that Jesus is not God's son. In fact, it claims that a decoy was put on the cross and Jesus wasn't actually crucified, contradicting the witness of the gospel accounts. It's only this postmodern zeitgeist that allows people to say, oh, well, Christianity is one aspect of the truth, and so is Islam, and so is Mormonism, and so is Scientology. Well, look at the actual distinct, clear, specific claims that they make. They're simply not compatible. And I would, again, argue that anything but the Christian worldview is internally contradictory.
All right. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, so kind of what I would want to say is it is interesting to posit, well, why can't you have the Christian worldview and other ones? Some things in Scripture are going to make that difficult because we've got very exclusive claims, like on the part of Christ, that he is the only way. So it doesn't really seem likely at all that you're going to be able to, kind of synthesize it within the other ones. Especially, and this is where my particular understanding of autonomy is going to become important, because I can actually justify the law of non-contradiction. I don't have to, put it inside this worldview that's never actually getting justified because, God's infallible because the Bible says so, because God's infallible because the Bible says so. I can actually give you decisive justification for using the law of non-contradiction and then showing that contradictory worldviews aren't all going to be true. I don't think the presuppositionalists actually can do that. But this is really this isn't the most interesting way to cash out this objection. This is what's known as the Christianity objection. Is you can just say, let's posit a worldview exactly like Christianity, but then like say that God is 4 persons instead of 3. The presuppositionalist doesn't really have a way out of that. So that's the more interesting way to cash out those sorts of objections.
All right, guys. Good stuff, man. Excellent job. The audience is satisfied. At least I hope so. From the comments I see in the audience, it appears that they are satisfied. You guys did great, man. And I appreciate you guys as always, man. You guys come on. I think, Seth, you've been on. I think you're close to double digits, Seth. You're very close to double digits being on the Gospel Truth, man. And I know, David, you are trailing Seth not by far, man. So it's always good to have you guys come on. I enjoy you guys' company on this show, and I'm gonna let you guys go, man. You guys have any closing remarks, any closing words?
Say thank you, Seth. I love you a lot, man, and it was a good talk. Thanks for being a good moderator, Marlon.
All right.
Yeah.
Anything,
thank you,
Seth?
too, David. Love you guys.
All right, cool. So also anywhere people can follow you, where you got a website, blog, YouTube channel, anything in particular?
No, I do all my arguments on Facebook.
I mentioned everywhere I'm affiliated with pretty much at the beginning, but my main channel is Faith Because of Reason. I'm working on what I'm hoping will be a pretty extensive video critique of presuppositional apologetics, where it'll be the same basic argument I gave in my opening statement here, but I'm really going to extend it and go into the details of these issues. It's probably going to be like an hour-and-a-half critique of presuppositional apologetics. So if that interests you at all, then yeah, check out my channel and subscribe.
All right. Cool, guys. I'm going to let you go. You guys take care. I'll be in contact with you guys. You guys take care. God bless you, all right?
All right.
All right. All right, folks. Another great debate, man. These two some killers, man. They some killers out there, man. You know what I mean? Two guys that know what they talking about, man. These guys are great. And I always enjoy, when Seth and David come together, man. They talk about these things because I know what I'm going to get. If I could be honest as a host of this show, and there's sometimes I get guys on, I don't know exactly what I'm gonna get. I think that comes with the territory of debating. You talk to some guys in the chat and the direct message, and they sort of give you a rundown of your theological position. You're like, okay, I think you'd be a good fit. And then they get on, and then they're real short, they're real pithy with the responses, and they're sort of struck on the, they live and they get struck about it. But when you get guys like Seth and David on, they're gonna give it they all, man. They're gonna study what the topic is, and they're gonna come prepared, and that's always a good thing when you host debates, man. And I appreciate these guys, and I appreciate you as the audience, because you guys are really supporting ministry, and I thank you so much. And I thank you for, I believe, Nick that gave us super chat. I appreciate you, Nick. Thank you so much for that. And there's a couple other guys who asked questions late. I'm sorry about that. I wasn't able to get the question, but I appreciate you coming on. If you could jump on earlier next time, I definitely will get your question in. And so once again, I just appreciate everyone supporting the ministry and supporting what's going on with the Gospel Truth. And all that, just if you can, make sure that you're liking and subscribing to the Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that like and that subscribe button. Please do, because this ministry is centered around engaging the culture of Christian truth. All right. And as always with any ministry, I need help. You need individuals to support. You need individuals to come through to do what they need to do in order to get the ministry growing and flowing, so that the masses, the world, can hear what the Gospel Truth has to say. All right. And it's by you guys' support that we are able to keep pushing forward in this ministry. With that said, I'm going to get out of here and shut this thing down. I thank you so much for joining me. Make sure that you subscribe, and make sure you don't leave this channel without subscribing, because there's a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future of the Gospel Truth. But I'm going to sign out. May God bless you, and may God keep you. Gone.